What's up, you guys? Stoopzz back again with another video, and today I am bringing you my BFA 8.1 range DPS tier list. Last week I released a melee ranked tier list for BFA 8.1, and a lot of you were waiting for this video to come out. Now, it's been about a week since I posted the last video because there were some recent changes that we saw with some tweakings to a few classes. A couple of the classes were going to be on this tier list, or are, I should say, on this tier list, and I wanted to see how things would play out. But in fact, those changes for both the melee DPS and the range DPS made little to no difference in their overall performance, and if anything, it kind of balanced things out quite a bit. And some of the other classes, I would say, moved up in rankings, were the top classes, those being, as you can see, a little bit of a teaser here, Elemental Shamans and Balanced Druids were not really affected too much, I would say, in these rankings. Now, really quickly before I hop into these tiers, you can also see that there's multiple tiers. So if you are somebody who's unfamiliar with how tiers work, typically S+ tier is going to be your highest tier, meaning that there's a big difference between some of those classes and the rest of the other classes, and then you're going to have several tiers down. Now, for this tier list, we only have 4 tiers: S+, S, A, and B. All of these classes, I would say, are somewhat viable. The S tier and the S+ tier are obviously some of the more viable classes, whereas the B tier can still work and the A tier can still work. However, there is somewhat of a difference between the lower end tiers, obviously, and the higher plus tiers. So just keep that in mind, but I wouldn't say that any of these classes are most certainly unplayable to where they will not work in arena. It's just my overview and my general thought process when I'm looking at these classes, how I would rank them and separate them into several tiers. So going right into the S+ tier, we have the 2 top performing range DPS classes. The first one being Elemental Shaman. Now, just the other week, we saw some changes to Elemental Shaman, some of them being nerfed to certain Azerite traits like Lava Shock, which has been nerfed time and time again. I think it's been nerfed almost to like 80% in PvP, but it's still hitting very, very hard. And a lot of Shamans are still opting to use Lava Shock. Some Shamans are opting to use Natural Harmony, which just buffs various stats when they use certain types of schools of spells like Fire and Frost or whatever. And I would say that even with these changes, Elemental Shamans are still very strong because the amount of damage they are dealing, but the way that they're dealing damage, they have multiple schools of spells, and they have just random bursts of damage that come from different abilities, right? We have things like Earthshock still hitting very, very hard, even though it's been nerfed so many times because of Lava Shock, the Azeroth trait that builds up your Earthshock. We also have things like Lightning Overload and Stormkeeper. These are random procs of damage that can absolutely almost global someone. We also have things like Lightning Lasso, if you're unfamiliar with that. Lightning Lasso, I'm sure you've seen. It is a great form of CC that really locks down the enemy and does about 40%. There was also a change to Lightning Lasso recently where it went from 48% damage when inside of Lightning Lasso, if we went for the whole duration, now down to about 40%. But that's still 40% of somebody's life, and it's still a form of CC. They still do great damage once again with their Earthshock burst. They also have amazing off heals, which are very reminiscent of Enhancement Shaman off heals before they got toned down and nerfed. Now, you do have to actually cast these off heals, whereas Enhancement has instant cast off heals, but they still heal for an an incredible amount. I mean, the amount that you can heal is like 30k plus healing surges, and that's great for a range DPS because it gives them great team utility. They also have team utility in things like Sky Fury. They also have team utility in things like Purge. They also have team utility in things like Grounding Totem. They have different elementals to keep people in combat. They can throw down an Earthbind Totem behind a pillar to keep the enemy in combat, and they just have great overall consistent damage and burst damage. They're all around well-rounded class. The only thing that I would say that kind of separates Elemental Shamans from Balanced Druids is they're just not as tanky. Now, they do have a very consistent wall and Ancestral Shift, I believe it's the term or the word for their wall. With their off-healing potential and their amount of damage that they're dealing and just their complete toolkit, they still are probably, in my opinion, if I was going to rank between Balanced and Elemental Shamans, I would put Elemental Shamans at the top. But the difference between these two classes is not the damage per se, it's just that Balanced Druids might be a little bit more tanky and a little bit more passive for a lot of the game, where Elemental Shamans are consistent in their damage, and then they have just random out of nowhere RNG bursts that can just shock you, literally shock you out of nowhere and just take someone out of the map instantly. And because of that and the fact that we are in a caster meta at the moment, if you're unfamiliar with what that means, We have, you know, 2 ranged casters like an Elemental Shaman and no surprise a Moonkin, and then like a Mistweaver Monk, and we're going to fight something else that's very similar with 2 casters and maybe another Mistweaver Monk or another healer on their team. Elemental Shamans always do good in those matchups because of things like Shear, all the interrupts that they do have with grounding, and obviously their knockback effects and their Lightning Lasso, and they're very disruptive purge. They do well in those types of matchups traditionally, and that's why I'd rank them at the top of the caster list at this moment. There are some melee comps going around right now, but when you're fighting a double caster as a double melee, you get dragged out into dampening. You do not want to be stuck with fighting an Elemental Shaman and a Balanced Druid, as they're hard to take out, and the longer the match goes, it's just the worse that it's going to be for you in the long run. Moving on to Balanced Druids. Balanced Druids still have some of the most insane damage. Star Surge still hits extremely hard, to the point where it's just random 40k procs of damage, random 30k procs of damage. I mean, you can see it coming, but when they line those up, it is extraordinary how much damage they can do. And with Elemental Shamans obviously on your team, you're going to be dealing random procs of burst that's hard to try and play around. Also, things like Incarnation puts you on a timer. Every time you have to survive Incarnation, you're just going to run into a scenario where you run out of time because dampening is going to start racking up. It's going to get hard for your healer to heal through the amount of damage they're dealing, and with the amount of CC that they have with things like Cyclone and Root Beam, it makes it very difficult to survive those difficult situations. And on top of that, if you are able to survive those long CC chains, you're just going to get hit with a huge Star Surge during Incarn, and you're just going to knock somebody right out of the arena. So they're very difficult to play around because of the timer that they put you on, and on top of that, during the time where you are able to do damage, they are very tanky. Killing a Balanced Druid is not easy. They have so many ways to heal themselves, so many ways to survive with like Iron Fur, Frenzy Regen, Renewal, their off-healing potential, Bear Form, Bark Skin. All of these abilities make Balanced Druid so difficult to take down. But if you do not target a Balanced Druid, he's going to spam out Cyclones and deal just absurd damage. And this is what really separates these 2 casters from the rest of the tier. All the other casters on this list, or ranged classes, are killable. I would say Warlocks are probably one of the more tanky casters as well, but these 2 classes are very difficult to take down. Insane off-healing potential. They're definitely the 2 strongest casters on this list, but keep in mind the date of this video, these classes could easily get nerfed, you know, next week, and they might not be the strongest. But if you do have one of these classes, I recommend picking one of them up or trying to group up with one of these classes, because you're probably going to see or fight a lot of them anyway. So if you can't beat them, then you might as well join them. Now, moving on to the S tier, we have Shadow Priest. Now, Shadow Priests have lost a little bit of their tankiness since 8.1, but they gain things like Greater Fade, which makes them also pretty difficult to take down. It's a different way of, you know, tanking damage. I mean, you can time Greater Fade if you're a good Shadow Priest to, you know, avoid certain types of CC or avoid big attacks. That's also great, rather than just standing there and then never going into Void Form. Now we are using Void Form, which does add a lot of pressure. We also have incredible CC. That is where Shadow Priests shine right now, because of their ability to land things like Silence into Psychic Horror, into Fear, into MC, or some Shadow Priests are opting to play Mind Bomb with like Windwalker Monks. They have a lot of CC potential, and they can put the enemy healer in a huge chain while they're dealing decent amounts of damage. And they also have great team utility with things like Life Swap. We have things like Mass Dispel. I can't spell Dispel, but we also have things like Purge. They have great team utility spells. Life Grip, I can't forget that one. They're a solid class to have on your roster. It's very enjoyable to play with the Shadow Priest when you're playing as a healer because of all the things that they can bring to the table. And they can repeat this CC chain like we talked about a second ago over and over and over again. If you can't kill them in between their survival windows, then you're going to go through one of those CC chains again, and that's very difficult for your healer to recover. So even though Shadow Priests lost some of their tankiness with Edge of Insanity, is what the PvP talent was called, but because we've seen some changes to that and buffs to Void Form, Shadow Priests are no longer taking that talent, but they still have ways to survive because of things like Disperse being buffed and allowing it to, or now healing them almost up to full HP. And I think Shadow Priest paired with any of these casters in the S+ tier make an excellent comp that is difficult to take down and very durable. And this easily makes them one of my top casters in the S tier. Now moving on to Warlocks, no surprise to some people, a big surprise to other players. I would rate Warlocks as one of the top casters, and if we do see more changes to some of the S+ tier classes, those being Elemental Shamans and Balanced Druids, I have no problem moving Warlocks into the S+ tier. All specs, those being Destro, Demo, and Affliction, are viable. Destro probably being one of the more prominent specs, Affliction also being a very prominent spec, and Demo still has its place in a lot of comps. It still does very well in 2v2 scenarios. I think Demo is a very underutilized spec, but Destruction has just so many ways to win the match, and it has, once again, that timer that it puts the enemy team on. I don't want to spend too much time going into each of the specs, but they all have a very similar, or at least Destruction and Affliction have a very similar timer mechanic, where Affliction Warlocks have a trait that allows them to suck their opponent dry with Drain Life. If you haven't seen this before, when they use Agony on a target, it builds up these stacks that makes their next Drain Life deal a bonus amount of damage, and they wait for these stacks to build up to about 50, and when they activate their Drain Life, it is simply a one-shot mechanic. Now you can stop this Drain Life, but they can wall for the Drain Life so they can't be interrupted. They can pop their Reflect, their Nether Ward, to make it so they can't be interrupted or CS'd. Now you do have to use things like, maybe if you're a warrior, you might have to Trinket a stun and then Stormbolt the target to try and stop the Drain Life, but there's only so many times you can do that. These moments put you on a timer to where if this Warlock gets off this Drain Life, it will almost one-shot you. Similar to Destruction Warlocks, some Warlocks play a Infernal trait that when they drop their Infernals, their Chaos Bolts deal a bonus amount of damage. They also play a trait, I believe, that comes from Incinerate or Immolate. I believe it is your Immolate, it's your dot. Whenever you're dealing damage with Immolate to a target above 80% health, I believe, you gain a X amount of haste, and if you stack 3 of those, it gives you just a massive, insane amount of haste that makes it so your Chaos Bolts just come out like instant. Now, when this happens, when they pop their Dark Soul, when they pop their Infernals, and they get off maybe 1 or 2 of these Chaos Bolts on you, it will almost one-shot you. A Chaos Bolt can hit anywhere from 50 to 60. I've seen even 80k Chaos Bolts. Now, you have to keep in mind that if you pair a Destruction Warlock with an Elemental Shaman, you pair a Destruction Warlock with a Shadow Priest, or you pair a Destruction Warlock with a Balanced Druid, or any of these other classes, you have to also look out for the other class, and you can't just solely avoid the Warlock. And eventually you get caught in a position to where a Chaos Bolt is going to land, or you are going to get hit with a Drain Life. And when fighting Demo, they're a different type of playstyle, but they can deal a lot of damage. They're more of a disruptive class. I'd recommend them more in 2v2 situations. They're still good in certain 3v3 comps, maybe when paired with an Elemental Shaman or one of these other S+ tier classes, or maybe a Shadow Priest. But nonetheless, all of these Warlock specs are very difficult to fight against, and recently Warlocks have been a lot tankier, so they put you on a timer. They are much tankier than they used to be in 8.0 because of some of the recent buffs, and they're very disruptive because of things like Death Coil, Infernal, because of things like Shadow Fury, because of their ability to spam out fears now, because of their ability to CS. Warlocks have always been a class that grows stronger as the expansion goes on. So I expect Warlocks to only get stronger in future patches. It's always the way that it works. It was the same way in Legion, and they work well in these caster metas, similar to Elemental Shamans, as they're good in a caster v caster matchup. Now Mage was one of the classes that was probably one of the top casters for 8.0, but they have kind of gone down in the rankings, I would say, not because of any, I mean, there were some nerfs along the way. Frost getting a slow nerf, which I don't think made a huge difference, but just made it a more enjoyable player experience when fighting against mages. And we had Fire getting a little bit of a nerf to Blaster Master, the Azerite trait that was dealing crazy amounts of one-shot damage. Now, and we have Arcane as well, and I'll talk about Arcane in a little bit, but there aren't many things I would say that have really dropped mages, except the fact that all of these other classes have seen some buffs and some changes, and Rogue Mage Priest isn't really a comp that we're seeing. Rogue Mage Pally isn't a comp that we're seeing too often. It's still a very, very strong comp, but Rogue Mage X, RMX, you know, it's a very consistent comp. It's a comp that's almost always been good. It's a comp that can almost always win most matchups. But I would say that because we're seeing a lot of these caster comps coming into the meta, Rogue Mage X doesn't always do good in dampening. They can still reset several times, but the longer the match goes on, the more difficult it is for the priest to keep up the rogue and the mage. If you're playing with the pally, eventually they run out of cooldowns. And when you are fighting these tanky dampener comps like balanced druids, maybe elemental shamans, shadow priests, maybe even warlocks, because of the disruption that they have and their ability to withstand damage and survive and drag you out into dampening, this doesn't work in the mage's favor. And mages have a hard time with things like elemental shamans. Mages have a hard time with things like balanced druids. Mages have a hard time with things like shadow priests. All of the classes except balanced druids have a purge, which makes it frustrating for things like temporal shield, right? We have elemental shaman purge, shadow priest purge, warlocks have purge. You know, things like death coil. All these things are very frustrating for a mage player when trying to land polymorphs. You have to go through grounding, you have to go through wind shear, you have to go through warlock CS. Whereas if you're fighting melee comps, it's easier to land those polymorphs on the enemy healer, making it easier for you to do your goes. And because of this, it's hard for me to rank mages as one of the top casters. However, they still are in the S tier simply because of Rogue Mage X, as it's still a solid, well-rounded comp that almost always works. You're just not going to see as many of them because of the other classes that are involved in the meta. Depending on what the meta is, and depending on what classes aren't doing well or what classes are doing well in the meta, then you might see the meta shift up a little bit. But as long as we have balanced druids and elemental shamans at the top, I don't expect to see mages all of a sudden be in the S+ tier. It just wouldn't make any sense. Now moving on to the final two specs or classes of the 8.1 range tier list, you can see that I have the A tier blank, and that is because I believe that the rest of these classes are much more closely grouped together, and I don't believe that any of them should be separated into the A tier. If anything, I might put mage into the A tier, but I still think RMP allows it to stay in the S tier. But I have Marksman Hunter and BM Hunter in the B tier. Now, unfortunately for some players out there, including myself, I have a Hunter. I really wanted to try out Marksman Hunter this patch, and although they have great burst, they're just not survival. Survival is just a much better complete spec in my mind for hunters at the moment, and even hunters, or survival hunters I should say, are not at the top of their tier list because they're not as tanky as Windwalkers, and they're not as tanky as Death Knights. They're not as tanky as some of the other melee classes that you need to be tanky to fight in this meta. If you're going to be fighting in these in this range caster meta in 8.1, you need to be tanky enough to survive into dampening, because you're probably not going to kill in the opener when fighting against elemental shamans, you know, moonkin druids, shadow priest, warlocks, maybe mages you can win pretty soon early into the opener, and maybe even a shadow priest, but you're not going to win that quick. And if you're not tanky enough to survive things like Incarn, Infernals, you know, Lightning Overload, Stormkeeper procs, if you're not tanky enough to survive those, you're just not going to do well into the meta. BM Hunter might be better. BM Hunter is probably better than Marksman at this point. Marksman Hunter does have great burst. BM Hunter does have decent burst. They both have CC, but once again, they're just not survival. They need to do some unique changes to the class to bring it into some of these other tiers. Once again, you can still play this class depending on what your goals are. So if you really want to play Marksman Hunter, I might start trying it out on my stream, which you can find a link to in the description box below. That's a shameless plug, but that is just my BFA 8.1 range DPS tier list as of 12/25/2018. A lot of these things can change based on a simple nerf or patch that might come in the near future, so keep that in mind. Here are all of the classes once again at a quick glance. You can notice once again that we have the A tier. No classes are listed in the A tier, and that is because a lot of the S tier classes are very closely grouped together, with the S+ tier being the two best range casters, I would say, and then unfortunately we have the B tier, and that's a feels bad man. Be on the lookout for my healer tier list, which will be coming out in the next couple of days or so. If you guys enjoyed the video, be sure to give it a thumbs up. If you have any more questions on my tier list, you can leave those once again in the comment section below. Big shout out to all my Patreon supporters who've been supporting this channel the whole time. If you are interested in supporting me on Patreon and keeping this channel running, as we are one of the only PvP channels left on YouTube, the link to all the information is in the description box below. And for supporting me on Patreon, you can also earn yourself some coaching. Try not to miss me on my Twitch live stream where I answer all of your guys' questions in depth. Do not forget to subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time.